All right, what we're going to do is I'm going to tell you first the background story of the Starchild, as we call it, and why we called it the Starchild, and we'll go from there. About 1930, a young woman of Mexican heritage was going to visit the old family village that her parents had come from when they snuck into the States. Now, this is again about 1930. It was very common for Mexicans, still is, for Mexican people to sneak into the States, to establish residence, to have a child born in the States, and therefore they become rooted, and then that's how they become citizens. So she was born in the States, and when she was about 15, they were finally citizens, her parents were, so that they could go and come back without a problem. So they went to visit the village, brought her, and when she landed there, they told her, one of the things they told her is, we do not go in the caves and mine tunnels in this area. Now, this is about 100 miles southwest of Chihuahua, Mexico. It's about 5,000 to 7,000 feet in high desert, what everyone would call high desert. Not too far from the Copper Canyon area, if you know anything about that. Mountain, not mountains, but kind of foothilly area, but with caves and with mine tunnels back to Aztec times. So that she was told not to go in there. You tell an American teenager what not to do. First opportunity she got, she snuck off with a large basket, ostensibly to pick flowers or fruit or whatever, but just to get away and do some exploring. She went into a mine tunnel and says that in the rear of it, far enough into where there was still enough light for her to see what she was looking at, she saw a human skeleton lying on its back on the dirt, which of course surprised her, but at that time, 1930, it's not odd to have seen skeletons of animals and everything else in the area where she came from. So she got up on it, and as she got closer, she noticed what she called a misshapen hand, bony hand, wrapped around the upper arm of the human skeleton lying on its back on the dirt, and the arm was coming up out of the dirt. So, gathering her courage, she pulled the dirt aside in what she found to be a shallow grave, and the dirt was loose. She was able to scrape it out with her bare hands. And of course, if you're buried in a mine tunnel, you're not going to get rain, you're not going to get compaction, so she would be able to do that after any length of time, really. So she did, and she found what she called a smaller skeleton, and it was a misshapen body. Now, if it's any degree misshapen like the head, the hand, and the body, we can understand that it was rather misshapen. But misshapen is the only word that we have that she said relative to the rest of the body. She recovered both full skeletons, both of them, but she knew she had done wrong. She was just compelled to do it. She thought it was interesting and fascinating as any kid would, but she didn't know what to do with them. So she put them behind a big tree near where the village was, and she was going to think about, what do I do here? How do I solve this problem? The next day, torrential rains began, and it rained for 3 days. By the time she was able to get back to the place where she had put the bones, they were all washed away in a torrent that had gone down the ravine that the tree was growing from. So she went walking downstream, and she found the 2 skulls hung up on bushes, but that's all she found. And this one had lost part of its face, and the piece of maxilla that we have was barely attached, and so that's how it was recovered. She put that in her baggage, easier to hide than the old skeletons. She snuck them back into the States. She kept them for her whole life, and then in the early 90s, just put them in a cardboard box in her garage, and that was it. Didn't do anything with them at all ever, other than just keep them as a souvenir or whatever. So as she was nearing death in the early 90s, she had made some friends, and she asked those friends to take the skulls over from her when she died, like you would seek a home for pets if you knew you were dying. And so she did. That couple took the skulls, the cardboard box, and just transferred them from her garage to their garage. And so the wife, over the course of 5 years, became uneasy with 2 skulls in a cardboard box in their garage, and she asked the husband to get rid of them if he could. So he knew a younger couple that were interested in UFO things, and they all recognized that this skull was unusual looking, and who knew, it might have some UFO significance. They invited that younger couple over, showed them the skulls, told them the story, and said, we would like you to just take them and do whatever with. And so they did that. The younger couple took them and are now the owners of the skull. And so they then began a search for somebody that would be able to find what this is from a scientific standpoint, because they knew that it just looks like the general outline parameters of a skull that would fit inside the head of a gray alien. If you all know what the standard gray is supposed to look like, the heart-shaped face, the bulging parietals, the dent in the top of the head, the very small narrow face, the very thin little neck. It's got all the hallmarks just to kind of look at it that you would expect. So they contacted me because of the work that I was doing at that time on human origins, asked me how long I thought it would take to get some answers. I said, well, with something this unusual, this fascinating, and this important, it's hard for me to imagine it would take more than 6 months to get scientists interested in it and get all the answers that we need. And here we are, pushing up on 6 years later. It has not been easy to get anybody really interested in doing anything about this. It's been a real amazing adventure into the world of mainstream restrictions on thought and on exploration. It's really been amazing. So that's the story of the provenance, what scientists call the provenance of the skull. That's a problem because we can't prove any of this quite yet, because the woman who gave it didn't really want to be involved in this, obviously, and her husband didn't after she died. The couple that gave it to the younger couple, they didn't want to be involved in it. So the backstory is a little bit iffy at this point. Not that we can't research and go back and find this place, but it'd take a little money, hire a private investigator, it would take some work to do it. But we could do it, and I've always felt like if we have a need to do it, we will be able to do it. But for now, we're just going to go with the story and accept it and believe it, because we have now had the two skulls dated, and they both, independently, different labs, 4 years apart, date out at 900 years before present, plus or minus 40 years, which means that the story is almost certainly true, that the two skulls are contemporaneous perfectly as far as carbon-14 dating goes. So that's pretty cool, and we're very satisfied that that story is probably true. Okay, now with that said, what we're going to do now is go through the comparisons of the physiology of the skulls so that you see how they're built and what the differences and comparisons are, a human versus this unusual skull, the Starchild skull. And then we're going to look at some of the recent science we've been doing that really up the ante as far as what we've suspected about it for a very long time. Okay, next slide. Okay, here we see a side-by-side comparison. As you see, sort of, it can see on the piano later when this is over with if you want to look more closely. But here you go. This is the human that was found with this one. Now, obviously, this is a human. There's no doubt about it. We've had it DNA'd. Human, no problem. This is a true bone skull. No doubt about that. Not a monkey, not an animal of any other kind. A true human-like bone skull. The difference is the bone here is 1/2 the thickness, or less actually, less than 1/2 the thickness of this. The weight of this skull, while approximately the same size, they would both fit in a space 15 cubic centimeters, so they're roughly the same size. This is a human being about 5 feet tall, a small female. It's a female. Small female. This is a skull about the same size, or an average like 12-year-old or a small human. Not quite our size. So they very well match up. Now next slide, you'll see that if you put a line so that their eyes are, the top of the eyes are set up the same, you see the differences in the size of the occipital orbits, and particularly the eye sockets. And you see that this is extremely shallow relative to this. It's hard to tell depth straight on like this, but you can see with that skull. But if I were to stick my finger in here, as I've done many times, it goes that deep, 2 full inches. That's everybody's eye sockets are that way. Our eyeballs are amazingly big. You stick your finger in here, it goes about right there. at its greatest depth. Very, very shallow. Also, you see the foramens have been shoved down about 1/2 an inch relative to these. And so what you would get if you have an eyeball in this, as we assume that it would have to be smaller, and the eyeballs would be sitting down here rather than up where they normally are. So you've got some strange things beginning right there. You do have the optic openings for the optic nerves right there, and the foramens for the vessels and blood vessels and nerves that feed and control and make it move. Ironically, though it doesn't look quite like it, this distance right here is the same as this distance right here. So they are the same apart as far as the midline, the middle goes, but they're not the same out here. As you can see, there's great reduction and great squeezing downward relative to this, and a foreshortening as well. Okay, now also too, what we're going to see is that the parts of this are the same as the parts of this, but they've been reconfigured and reconstituted. The bone itself has been reconstituted, and all the parts have been reconfigured. And one of the first ones we're going to look at is the chewing muscles. You see this line right here? It goes up. You'd be surprised how high your chewing muscles attach up the side of your skull. And this shows it right here. The chewing muscles come from down here through the zygomatic arch right up through there. All right. With this one, with the Starchild, this area of staining just about covers it. It ends right there. So there's a tremendous reduction in the chewing muscles and where they're attached. It has them, but they're much smaller, and it indicates that the face is much reduced relative to a normal human face. Now, when we first got going with this, we were told for a number of reasons that it was a child, which is why we called it the Starchild. And this is one of them. When an infant is born, its face is roughly 1/8 of the total cranium volume. Adults, as we sit here today, our face makes up 1/2 of our cranial volume. So you grow from 1/8 to 1/2 as you mature into an adult. This was so small initially, we all assumed and thought that all the parts are so small, we assumed that it was a child, and we were told that for a number of reasons that we'll go through. Now I don't particularly believe that, and we'll go over that as well. Okay, so basically this is the frontal comparison. We're going to look at different parts of this as we move on, but that basically what you want to understand is the extreme difference in the eye sockets. Extreme difference. Oh, and also too, it's important to add, there is absolutely perfect symmetry in the surfaces here of these two depressions, as there is here, but not as much. There's symmetry, but it isn't really perfect. There are unevennesses about it, but that's normal. This is really more symmetrical in its design than typical human skulls. It's astonishingly symmetrical. When you stick your fingers in here, you feel little dents. You can do it on the copy there and feel it for yourself. You'll feel little dents, little rises, little dents, and those little dents are where the muscles attach that control the eyes, and it's one of the reasons that we believe it did have eyes. But if it did, again, they're down, they're smaller, and they would have a much larger upper lid if indeed they had to be wiped. The film had to be wiped like our upper lid serves the purpose of doing that. So, next slide. All right, in the profile, there's a lot to talk about here, but I want to start out with, notice the human had a concussion here at some point. That is a concussion mark. But we see the differences, the extreme differences. She has a very flat rear head because she was cradle boarded in her youth. Cradle boarding is a very typical practice in primitive communities, which a baby is born, the mother has to continue to work, can't take much time off. So and most mothers in those primitive societies have to bend down, stand up a lot. You can't have your baby's head snapping around like this, so you have to tie it down to a board, put the board on your back and do that. It's called cradle boarding, very common. And what you get is this effect right here, of flattening of the rear of the head down to this knot, the knot we all have in the back of our head called the inion. You can't go below that because that's where your neck begins, right here, and your neck wraps around like that. So, flat to here. You'll see that the Starchild is flat to that point and then flattened right on down to the neck. And it also, this is very flat to the touch of your hand, but this is not, as we saw earlier. So the Starchild was not cradle boarded. This was cradle boarded. Classic example of it. Now, we talked about the parts. The parts are the same. Frontal bone, sphenoid, temporal, parietal, and occipital bone back here. Parts are the same, but you can see they're reconfigured into a different size, different arrangement, different shapes. And again, the bone itself is reconstituted. Now, you see this is the zygomatic arch, cheekbone, wrapping around, connecting to the eye socket right here, connecting to this knob right here, and in here, and you'll see it. I can stick my 2 full fingers can go up there very easily. That's where the chewing muscles go, up through here, and you can see the connection line right there, wrapping around like that. Huge area, and you see with the Starchild, it just comes through there. Much reduced. All right, you see this bone in here? That's that there. People say, what's that flipper thing? Well, it's just, it braces your face out so that if you take a bad lick in the face, this bone can keep it from crunching in and smashing your brain and you're dead. It's just a protective device, as far as I know, as much as anything. Now, another thing to notice is that in these parts, there's significant shifting of the neck. The neck, the foramen magnum right here, the neck goes in about right there, which is rear of center for a human being, whereas it's dead center right here for this. Now, what's interesting is that a human face is for the most part hollow. So in order to get the balance point correct with all this solid brain here, you have to move it back. But with this, there's a very small face, there are no sinuses, we're going to see in a minute, and there's more brain. There's 1,600 cubic centimeters of brain in this skull. There's 1,200 cubic centimeters of brain in this skull, essentially the same size, same relative size. Now, as we sit in this room, we have about 1,400 cubic centimeters in our brains. That's average. But again, this is a small human, about the size of a 12-year-old. So it's 1,200 cubic centimeters versus 1,600 cubic centimeters, fully 1/3 more brain, lot more brain. And so what an immediate problem you have with that much brain is this. Here, in a normal human being, this is rounded. This is without the flattening, the normal. You have, all of us without being flattened, have a roundness like this, like a curve. And that's where our cerebellum sits, in here. Under our cerebrum, which is the main part of our brain, cerebellum sits down in here. And it's connected to some flanges of bone in here, called the sulcus, the sagittal and transverse sulcus, and it's not really in this. You can feel where the stumps of it was, but you don't really have it. It's not there. And the inside, this is the external occipital protuberance, or any, and there's a protuberance inside that's just as thick almost, called the internal occipital protuberance. And that too is not really here. So you've got a weird situation relative to the brain. As we sit with our cerebellum sitting here and our cerebrums on top of it, this has to last us our whole lives, with that 3 pounds of brain pressing down on our cerebellum, which is our motor function, basically, that part of our brain. So it's spread out over a pretty wide area as the brain sits on it, because over 60, 70 years, that's a lot of pressure. So you have the support structures and you have the cerebellum set apart, and it will last. But over here, as you can see, you're looking at a very pinched up area. It's up to, I've been told, about 1/4 the area that you have here in a normal skull. You've got about 1/4 of that, and you've got 1/3 more brain pressing down, and you're missing the ledges of bone in there to support the cerebellum if it has a cerebellum. So you've got way more brain pressing down on a much tighter area. How did it function? How did that happen? How did that cerebellum not just get squashed? But it doesn't seem to have, because it seems to have lived on well beyond childhood. So this is one of the real mysteries for brain guys. One of them said to me after a long examination, he says, I don't know if this thing even had a cerebellum like we do, or if it did, it might be a completely different substance. Much more durable, much stronger. Okay, next slide. That's just showing that we had it leveled up as well. Now this is the rear, and you see the dramatic difference in the rear of the heads. This point right here is your standard knot at the back of your head, the inion, and this is the cradle boarding. You can see the flatness now. It covers this area right here, which is really about the size of the palm of my hand on the skull. This is drawn up, but you see this connection point right here. You see it all the way up here. It's like someone just pulled it up and straightened it out and flattened it out. All right, now this area is all neck. You can see the neck connections right here. The rough areas are where the muscles of the neck connect right through there. This one, this is where this is on this. Instead of being a knot, it's a dent, it's a fossa, it's a depression. Here is where you can see the connection of the neck muscles down here that you see up here. So it's greatly reduced. The neck of this thing is much smaller, as much as 50% less. In the same way that the chewing muscles are about 50% less, the neck is about 50% less. And remember, the neck is positioned directly under the head, so that it's lined up in the medial flexion and the flexion points for medial and lateral flexion, so that it's like a weird golf ball sitting on a golf tee, rather than a neck like we have, big neck here to hold our head up and have our face hanging off the front of it. So we also have here the ability to see that we have reductions in the mastoid processes, which are the things behind the ear. It's hard to tell, but they're much bigger. We'll get a better view of them in another slide, but I just want you to be aware that there's some significant differences on the back side here that you'll see when we flip it up to the underside. And also, most importantly, notice the difference in the crown of a human head and this one, this dent, this obvious dent that you can really notice on the skull itself, and how symmetrical that is, how well put together it is. In deformity, one of the hallmarks of standard normal deformity is asymmetry. It's ugly. It just doesn't look good. This is very good looking. And also, too, another hallmark of deformity is you get, as particularly in primitive cultures, you get one thing wrong with your face, a big hair lip or something, you might make it. You get two things wrong with your skull when you come out of the chute, you're in real trouble. You get three things wrong, and they're pretty much going to get rid of you and start over and try again. In primitive societies, this is the way it is. With this skull, absolutely everything is wrong. There's nothing that's right. There's nothing that fits the norm, and yet it lived, and for quite some time, as far as we can tell. That doesn't make sense. How could it live? How could it be so different in every absolute dimension and still live? To be allowed to live and rise on up in years. All right, next slide. All right, we're looking at the top view now, and we see that basically, now this is a shift in that we couldn't really get a good match up here, so it's not, this one's tilted a little far forward. But again, you see the clarity of the crown look of a normal skull versus the dent. I hope you can see how distinctive that heart-shaped look is, because that's the look that you see so often on the grays as they're depicted. Now, you see the sutures connecting here, coronal suture, sagittal suture, sagittal suture. And the staining, by the way, is burial, not burial. Basically, the way we explain it, burial in the dirt. But the back of this head, though the light in the photograph that you saw from the rear bleaches it out, it is noticeable staining like this. So you can, the story of laying on that dirt while this one is buried does hold up. But this is it basically from the top view. Oh, and also too, it's conceivable. Someone once said, well, maybe it had 3 lobes to its brain. 3 lobes to its brain. Could be, because of the differences in what I told you about this. Who knows? It could be true. We don't know that. Next slide. Okay, this is a very interesting view because it gives us a number of things to look at and consider. Remember talking about the zygomatic arch, and I said I could put my 2 fingers through. You see, this is where the lower jaw, the chewing muscles, come up through and wrap up into the head, just so you get that perspective. Now, this is the zygomatic arch as we were talking. It connects into the eye socket. So here it's broken off, but it would be going up from this little stub right here, and it would be wrapping around to do that. It's very small, it's very short. Instead of 2 fingers, you could get maybe a couple of fat drinking straws to go up underneath what would be there, the way it's set up. It's all very compressed, very much smaller. Now, with this, you can see, remember the mastoid processes I was telling you about, the things behind your ears. This is the ear right here, so you can kind of imagine the ear wrapping around. Mastoid, mastoid. Look at the size here and the reduction of the size of them. Much smaller. You see that? Now, these are the condyles. You see this right here? This is what the neck, the head sits on and flexes on to the part of the spinal column that connects to it. Look at the size of the condyles here. They're greatly reduced. Now, this is the the fossa, the mandibular fossa. This is where the jawbone touches in and connects and works. So you see the difference in this one relative to this one. You see the difference in the size. Everything about this is reduced. Look at the neck area. Look at all this table here. Look how much reduced. Small. So the idea that it was a child was not at all unreasonable. Everything seemed so much reduced. Child. So we bought into that and stayed with it for quite a while. And the teeth were told, we were told that the teeth were indicative of a child as well, so we went with that. All right, now the teeth are important, so I want to talk about this because we have this piece right here, the right maxilla. And what you notice is with any set of teeth, you have 8 on a side. You've got 2 incisors, you have a canine, you have 2 premolars or bicuspids, then you have a couple of molars, and you have the wisdom tooth. And you're missing the wisdom tooth here, but otherwise you have the same thing, essentially. With this one of them's a spot seems to be missing. It's a small, very small piece of bone, relatively speaking, and it seems to have a natural missing slot, which we'll see when we get to that in just a minute. But I want you to be aware of that. Now, this part right here, you see, is missing. This is called the basilar part, exotic name, basilar part, and it comes through right here, and it's missing here. Now, what you read in the texts is that this fuses at around the age of 25. So that was another reason to say, well, it must be a child because it's missing its basilar part. But it also can snap off fairly easily, and inasmuch as the face was so battered, it could have been that just bounced off or got knocked off or whatever. But anyway, it is clearly missing, but you see what it would look like, and you also see that they are essentially the same width. And in fact, we've measured it just recently. Again, I had measured it before. Just like the bridge of the nose, these are exactly the same across 30 centimeters. 30 millimeters, which is average, which is standard. There's nothing unusual about this. Okay, next slide. All right, now we see an X-ray comparison of the two, and I want to talk about sinuses for a minute. You see the sinuses here in the human, pretty standard, frontal sinuses, ethmoid sinuses. The whole package here is fairly extensive, like a cauliflower sitting up there in your head. But now notice, not even a vestige. Not even a vestige. Now, what you'll hear is that when a child is born, they're small, and they are. Your sinuses do grow over time. But you see little, like raisin clumps there. You should see something. Nothing. Nothing, nothing, nothing. All brain in here, wall-to-wall brain. It's as if it's designed to pack more brain in. Reduce the eye sockets, take out the sinuses, more brain for me now, kind of thing. So notice too, if you will, for as weird as all this looks, there's kind of a, and I don't understand, it's kind of like a ghost brain in there. You see kind of how it looks? You can see the veins running because they leave tracks on the inside of the bone. Look at this. Look how weird that is. It's like a two-layer brain or something. Isn't that strange? But now the thing I like whenever I show this slide that gets people the most is check how weird the outside corner of the eyes is. You know, the grays with those weird things coming up the sides of their eyes. You know, they have those kind of weird eyes. So I mean, I don't know what it means. Can't say anything about it, but I'm just saying that it is unusual, to say the least. So, all right, next slide. All right, this is a profile shot, same thing, X-ray, and then you see again the flatness. But again, even though it looks like this, it's an artifact of the filming, because if you put your hand on it, it feels like a table. It feels like a board. It's very smooth. The human one. Now, this one we couldn't get the same, though we tried. To balance this up, you see you have to brace something here against it. We did the best we could, but we didn't get the eyes quite close, but not exactly right on this shot. Excuse me, but it does give you a very clear picture of how amazingly different this part of it is. But notice, you see this little triangular, whatever that indentation is, you see a similar thing right here. So it gives you an idea of how far we were off in placing it up because of this being here and this not being, not being there. But the key to this, a couple of keys to this shot is, look, where we have thin bone in our temple area, and it goes out and gets thicker and thicker as it comes out, and it's thick all through here. Notice that with the Starchild, it's thin right out to the edge, all the way around. The bone is thin uniformly. And also notice that you see the veins going up, wrapping where the brain is pressing up against the bone, and you see the same thing here, indicating again no hydrocephaly where you would have water between the brain, although you could argue that there might be water in the brain, but nobody that really knows about this and studies it insists that it is. They all feel like hydrocephaly is not really a possibility. All right, next slide. All right, now this is the piece of maxilla that we've talked about, that I've talked about, and we see it here, and we see that there was another apparently tooth here, another molar, and notice how big they are relative to how small this is. Now this is really small, and it's flat. The roof, the palatine plate, is what it is. Yeah, it's very flat. But here you have incisor. One, if that's a canine, that would be there. One bicuspid molar, and then a molar here. And of course, we have no way to know if there would have been like a room for an eye tooth, but it looks like it's breaking off about right there. There could be more here, though. There could be more. Probably was. So you're missing a hole, missing a tooth to fit the space. And you have to ask yourself how nature would know to do that. We're going to come up with a really small face, and we're going to leave this one tooth out, and we're going to make good-sized teeth to go in there. It's just unusual.
Coming from the team.
Sure.
It's a juvenile maxilla.
He's a dentist, so he gets to talk.
That's incisor canine, deciduous molar, biggest space there for permanent molar behind that. So
you think this is normal?
For somebody under the age of 11.
You think so?
Yes.
Okay. Well,
11
the reason I say this, Matthew, is because when in a dental lab, when they began to really work on the teeth, they began to say that this can't be, they would have said the same thing, but it can't be a child. That's what they came up with, and I'll tell you why in just a minute. But for right now, the original take on it was that it was a child. Reason being, the piece is so small, the teeth look small to your eye, and in these holes here, there are other teeth waiting to come down. Clearly, can't miss them. Other teeth in here, although you can't see them because of the way they are. Grant's seen them. You can hold the piece, you can see them. They're there. The whole rack is ready to come down again. So when we had that X-ray and we saw that, we said, oh well, then that's children because it's a child because if you got teeth down and teeth up, that's a child. Everything else about it said child. So we went with that. All right, but this, by the way, is the front of it. You see this? This is the nasal opening. So it had a nose. It breathed like we would. That was the nose opening. So next slide. Now we'll see a close-up of that bicuspid. Now, when they began to really look at it carefully, under magnification like this, they began to see, as you can see, that there's considerable wear on it, and you have pitting of the enamel, and you have what's called crazing. You see this cracking along the enamel? Crazing. And crazing, I was told, takes quite some time to develop. And this kind of wear is hard to imagine in a child. Hard to imagine in a child, even with a gritty diet, which one would assume from that era, that time, grinding corn and stuff like that. Even with, that's a lot of wear and tear on a tooth, but the crazing is what sold the experts that looked at it that it's like 15 years of chewing a lot of ice, for example. It's just hard to get that kind of look to a tooth that's in the head of anything less than like a 20-year-old. So that was when we began to have our first indication that we were not necessarily dealing with a child here. And then when we went back and we had, if we go back to another slide, go back to the rear shot.
To the rear shot.
Yeah. Rear view, number 4. Okay, we're on number 10 now. You see this right here? These things are called Wormian bones, or islands. And these are so extensive, and you see some here, but these are so extensive and so large, relatively speaking, that people who study this sort of thing said, that is hard to imagine in a child. That a child would have enough time to fill in these gaps with bone, because that's what it is. As it grows, as the sutures are pulled apart, they have to fill in with little pockets of bone, and that's what happens over time, but it doesn't happen right away. So this was another strong indication that we weren't looking at a child, we were looking at something on up in years, perhaps in the 20s. Okay, so now go back to 10. All right, so this convinced me and the Wormian bone that we indeed weren't looking at a child. And it did look, the skull looked like it always looked to me like it had some age to it. I always had trouble thinking of it as a child. It just didn't look childish. Because I went to a place called Medical Modeling in Golden, Colorado, and they brought out about 20 children's skulls to compare to. And we had, in my other slide presentation, I had several of those comparisons. And when I looked at those skulls, real skulls, compared to this one looked really bigger, so much bigger, and so much more robust and so much more used up. It just looked older in every dimension, and I always had a hard time accepting it. But I did because I was being told by experts that it was a child, but I don't think that anymore. All right, next slide. All right, now we're going to change. That's the physiology we've gone over. What we're going to look at now is the work that has been done recently, and it starts with my partner here, Grant, taking a piece of bone that I had left here when I was here a year ago to a scanning electron microscope at Royal Holloway and having the bone looked at that way. And this is what we got. You can see the standard cut on the bone, and you see, because no, there was no reason to do otherwise. We had just cut it, cut it with a Dremel blade. You know what a Dremel blade is? Looks like a flashlight sort of, and it just spins a rotary blade, and you just go whoop, 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 whoop. You make 4 cuts, and the chunk of bone falls out, and you cut it into pieces, and that's really it. And the piece came from up here, because you didn't want it to be contaminated by any fingers touching it on the inside. The outside is shellacked, so we knew it had a coating of shellac on it, but we didn't want any contamination, so we cut up from here where no one could have ever got through the neck hole and touched. So that's what we did. So what you see here is the residue from the cutting process, and that would be bone powder and perhaps some of the residue off of the blade itself, because it was a blade coated, we think, with carbon fiber, and so some of that would be the same thing. We're going to look at a close-up of this. Next slide. We're going to look at a close-up of this area. Okay, next one. And you just see just debris, just standard bone debris, and I will tell you that when they cut it, it made a cloud in the room, just exploded little pieces of dust, and we had to open the windows, and it smelled like teeth being drilled. That's what surprised me. That distinctive odor of teeth being drilled. I know you know. He's sitting here.
No, seriously, but like burning smell.
Yeah, that burning tooth smell.
That's a smell of collagen being denatured at a high temperature. Which is not really good news.
Yeah, well, whatever. That's what collagen, isn't it?
Yeah, that's just
Say that again now.
Collagen being denatured.
That's the smell.
That's amazing.
Of collagen
That's
being.
You heat collagen up to by friction. Without adequate coolant, it will smell burnt tissue.
Isn't that fair?
But
Yeah,
you smell a horse being shoed, the same thing, like the smell of the hot.
So that's not the enamel. That's the collagen.
There's collagen in enamel, much more in dentin and bone.
Right.
Okay.
That's collagen.
Well, I'm going to just stop the flow of this to give you a little something right now that we heard this. The 2 geneticists who cut the bone in Davis, California, almost 2 years ago, they've cut a lot of bone, and they said that number one, it smelled more like tooth than they ever really smelled, and it was harder to cut. So that was 2 distinctive things about it. I had never been around it, so to me it was like, oh, this is bad, this is terrible, but I assumed that was the way it always was, and they said, no, it's not like this all the time. It has a distinctive odor, and it was harder to cut than usual. Now, we just got back the dating last week, literally Monday of this week, of the Starchild bone. We knew the human was 900 years plus or minus. Now, I've told you that it's much thinner, the bone, than normal human bone. When they sent it to the lab, that Beta Analytic in Florida that did the carbon-14 dating of it, the word they sent back was, boy, this thing is packed with collagen. It's as if, to them, you would take a file and compress it, like the amount of collagen that should have gone in the right size of the bone had been squeezed down, and it still had that much collagen in it. They were very surprised at the overload of collagen in the bone. That might explain that unusual burst of odor when they cut this bone, for what that might be worth. We don't understand this collagen thing. We just got the word on Monday. We're trying to figure it out. But this is an ironic verification of what they said. We'll have to try to figure out what that means. We don't know.
Very well, no, it's worth mentioning as well that this thing with collagen is particularly unusual, given that it's 900 years old.
Oh yeah, right. It should have been desiccated away. A lot of it should have just been broken down. 900 years old. That's a very good point. Thanks for mentioning that. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense in a number of ways, and that's one of the ways it doesn't make sense. Okay, next slide. This is the outer surface detail with the scanning electron microscope. You will get a very different look later of a binocular microscope. Just keep in mind, this is the way it looks under a scanning electron microscope. The outer surface of the Starchild bone, that is varnish. Actually, it's varnished. It doesn't look like it. It's going right through the varnish and getting this look to the bone. All right, next slide. This is the inside of the skull. And again, you'll get a very different look with the binocular microscope. But there you see some of the debris hanging around on it. Next slide. And here's where things began to get interesting. When we took this shot and saw this thing right here. Next, get it. And this doesn't really belong. It's a fiber of some kind, or a capillary or something. It's something that doesn't belong in normal bone. And that was the first indication that we had something unusual here when Grant was having the first series of analysis done with the scanning electron microscope. Next slide. Now we have another shot of the bone, and here we have, this is called the cancellous bone. This is cortical bone up here, top and bottom, cortical, cancellous, and this is where the marrow is. The marrow flows through those holes. And as you see the standard debris again from the cut, this is the same cut that we did in Davis about 2 years ago, but look at these things here coming out of the holes. Now this was a big surprise. Nobody knew and still doesn't know what these are. We just call them fibers. We don't know what they are. We don't know if they're bacteria. We don't know if they're fungi. We don't know if they're capillaries. We don't know if they're organic. We don't know if they're inorganic. But we did take it to a mycologist to study the shots that you're going to see. Next slide, we're going to see this one up closer than that one. This is, we call the knot. They said they had 3 of the top ones in England said they had never seen anything like it. They did say there are 30,000 possibilities or more. So we have to do a test called a Maldi-Topf, which will tell us if it's bacteria, if it's fungi. But at this point, we have no idea what it is. And as you can see, it's pretty doggone bizarre. Next slide. And they're not exactly the same. Look, these are more like hairs or threads. Next slide.
It's worth mentioning that how they're even there. The fact that they weren't shredded by the cutter as well.
Yeah, and it's,
and they're so tough.
How did they hold up? How did they have the durability not to just be sheared off? Next slide. Now we see one example here. The blade is spinning at a very high rate here, cutting smooth. And you know how when you get to the end of something, you kind of let up on the blade, and it apparently let up just enough to cause a little shear here, and then we have what we call the rough cut through here. And we're going to focus on this area right in here because we have some very interesting stuff. And you see another one down here, but we focus, and maybe one right here, but we focus on this one. Okay, move in. Okay, we're going to focus on this. You see, begin to see this in here. Fibers. Next slide. Yeah, that area is where we're going to close up now. Next slide. Look at all this. And notice it's stretched from up here all the way down here. Like something biological, but we're not sure. We don't really know. We have to find out what this is, but it's very, very bizarre. Next slide. Now see, oh, if you go, I'm sorry, can you go back one? I want to point, I should have pointed out as just a reference. Yeah. See this right here? Button or whatever you want to call it. We're going to come in on that now. Next slide. See it? You see it's coming still through the bone here. Piece looks like another piece here. And look at this. This is the base of another one, but of a different kind. Of a different kind. Next slide. See this? This is this kind, and this is this kind. Much thinner, like the hair things that we saw. But there's it's like a root of it, and we're going to focus in on this and get a much closer look at that. See how it spreads out from like a root? It either starts here and goes up, or comes and spreads out. We don't know. We don't know. All we know is this isn't right. That this is not part of bone. So we have something very unusual here. Very unusual. Next slide. Okay, now here's another piece of rough cut, and we can't tell if this was attached here. And we've got some stumpy things. We got this. We got but look at this. We call it the staple. Look at this. Okay, now we're going to look at this part right here. Next slide. You'll see that we're going to focus on that. Now watch this close up. Next slide. Look at this. Sheared off right here. Isn't that weird? Isn't that weird? And it just all you can say as a speaker, as a lecturer, is, what is it? We don't know. I mean, there's nothing to say. Nobody's seen anything like it. So there's nothing to compare it to. It's just we have to find out what this is. Plain and simple. Next slide. All right, now in doing the scanning electron microscope, it allows you to zero in on very, very fine points and see what the chemistry is of that particular point that you zero in on. So while Grant was doing it, they did several of those, and this is your standard look of bone. This is calcium, all this is calcium, phosphorus, oxygen, carbon, and the rest of them sit down here: silicon, aluminum, magnesium, sodium, sulfur, chlorine. So this is the look that you look for in bone. Next slide. But now what's different about this one? The aluminum has jumped up, way up, relative to what it ought to be. Now, you can make an argument that there might have been aluminum sulfate on the cutting blade, or in some other way the aluminum got contaminated, the bone got contaminated with aluminum. But there's a lot of aluminum in this thing. There's also a lot of places where there is no aluminum. So we don't have consistency, but we have a mystery. Next slide.
It couldn't have anything to do with the diet. Sorry, what is
no,
the question?
Aluminum's poison. Aluminum's poison. No. If it was diet, it wouldn't be human. No. It's got to be some kind of external thing, really. But here you see, it's a real jump here. A real jump. So this is what got him excited, got Grant excited, the fibers and the aluminum. And that's why I got called over from the States to come over and try to help get to the bottom of this. And Grant and Belinda and I have been doing that for the last 4 months that I've been here. So, next slide. Okay, this is another jump in the aluminum, but also the oxygen and the carbon. And this is, as Matthew was saying, collagen. This is what you get when you hit on a piece of collagen directly. It's going to look like this.
No, that's carbon actually. That's carbon.
Yeah, carbon, but this look of the whole thing is collagen. This is how collagen, yeah, that's what he said.
Ah.
Yeah. The elevated oxygen and carbon is the collagen. But the bone is layered, understand. You've got bone, you've got regular calcium hydroxyapatite, which is bone, apatite bone, and then you've got collagen. But also, and you'll find this of interest, Matthew, he hit a couple of spots on it where it showed like dentin. It showed like enamel. And he said that was strange. He hadn't really seen that before. It had the signature of more like enamel than apatite bone. So for what that's worth. But it's still a mystery. It wasn't consistent. He just found it in a few places. We need to do a lot more work on the scanning electron microscope to really find out how this bone is layered out in the skull. Okay, next slide. All right, now here we're looking at the binocular. Remember the binocular microscope? That's what we've been looking at. I'm just going to stress that again. All right, again, the cortical bone, top and bottom, but you begin to see the layers here in the Starchild that you don't, it's not so much here, it's not so much in the other one, in the human one, but you do begin to see it here. Now these, again, this is a cut that I did with the owner of the skull, and in our dermal blade, instead of using the carbon reinforcement, we used diamond. We paid the extra money, got the diamond, but and I think we got cleaner cuts, and I don't think we made as much debris, but we do, as you see, there is debris in the holes. Okay, next slide. Now this is the human. We also cut the human one, and this is the bottom right corner of the human, and you see how clean the holes are. Well, I think your thing is going down. Yeah. But you see, normally when you die, that's what happens. Bacteria cleans out all the cancellous holes, just cleans them out of all the organic material in there. Especially after 900 years, there shouldn't be anything at all. Next slide. We see the left corner of it. And the same thing, nice and clean. This is our cut with the diamond bladed Dremel. Next slide. Okay, now this is the inside of the human skull. And notice, if you will, the incrustation, the deep, wide, thorough incrustation of 900 years spent in a high desert environment. This is basically sand blown in and accreted and encrusted onto the inside of the skull. Okay, notice this little pit here. It's really important. That pit there, we're going to zero in on that. Next slide, and you'll see it. Should be circled. Yeah, we're going to close up on that. And there you can see the accretion. You can see the grit, sand. It's exactly what you would expect on a skull, exposed to the air, 900 years in that kind of environment. All right, next slide. This is the outside of the human skull under its layer of shellac, and you see these just dimples. I don't know what else to call them. It's like dimples on a golf ball, but you can see them with a magnifying glass if you look at it. I mean, it's just the way it is. And this is fairly standard. And by the way, the woman put the layer of shellac on it when, not too many years after she got them, she put the layer of shellac on them, she had said. So, okay, on both of them. Next slide. This is a close-up, again, of just the dimples of the human. Close-up. Next slide. This is the inner surface of the Starchild. No incrustation. Buried, you could argue, but still, you should be encrusting even more, you would think, if you were buried and you have the minerals right up there to get in over 900 years, but not so. But you do have some debris here in this little slit, but no incrustation. Next slide. You see a close-up of that. Some, but not much. That's kind of incrustation. It's not necessarily debris, because it looks kind of like the debris in the human one as well, in the pit in the human one. So it looks like from the same area kind of thing, but not nearly what it ought to be. And notice that you have the little dimple things here on the inside of the Starchild. Inside. Next slide. This is the outside of the Starchild under the layer of shellac. You will notice the complete absence of dimples. No dimpling at all. None. Next slide. This is a close-up of the outer surface of the Starchild. And again, it's very much smoother. Again, you can see that with just a magnifying glass. It looks different at the surface. Next slide. This is a comparison of the two insides. And you see how very, very different they are. Next slide. But what really knocks you out is the next one, the outside. All the dimples, no dimples. I mean, you don't have to be a scientist to see you're looking at something substantially different here than it should be. And these are all mysteries and questions that we have to answer. Next slide. Now, this is a polished look at the polished surface of the human female bone. Now, the way this is done is it's not cut at all. It's designed not to put any debris at all in the holes. They break it off. They take pliers and they snap it off, and then they put it on a polishing wheel and they very carefully polish it and grind it down. So you see there's just no debris. It looks like alabaster. It's beautiful. I mean, to me, this is really, and this is human bone. And this is the outside layer. Next slide, you'll see the inside layer. And you can see the layer of incrustation. And you do see some layering here, just as you see in the Starchild, where you get more layering on the bottom side than you do on the top side. But look how nice and clean everything is in the polished bone. It's beautiful. Next slide. Now, this is the same effect with the Starchild. The layering, polishing, but it isn't quite as dramatic as the human ones. You know, they did it the same way, but it didn't come out the same way. But you see also a little red tinge there. And, you know, you're beginning to notice something strange. Next slide. And now you see something really strange. See the layering and all this, but you see these red flecks up in here? What is wrong with this picture? 900 years, there should be nothing in there. And as you saw with the human, there is nothing. But yet, here we're looking at something. Next slide. We'll get a close-up of this area. And watch. Look at this. All we can figure at this point is desiccated marrow. desiccated marrow. Now, as Grant has pointed out, well, blood turns black at death. Why wouldn't it be darker than that? We don't know. It doesn't have to be biological. It could be mineral of some kind. But the point is, whatever it is, it shouldn't be there. So we have to try to figure out what it is. And one of the ways we're going to have to do this is the mycologists tell us that we can actually clip off pieces of those fibers and study them and see what they are chemically. In the same way, we can pick out chunks of this stuff and figure out what it is chemically, whether it's biological, mineral, whatever it is. But these are things that must be done to answer the mystery of what this skull is all about. Next slide. Now here's another look at a different look at the bone, very well backlit, so that this stuff really shows up and you begin to get a sense of how much of it there is. We're going to close up on just the whole area now next. Next slide. But look at it. It's really amazing. Really amazing. Totally unexpected. Totally bizarre. And if that is organic matter, if that is, here's the importance of this, if that is desiccated marrow, it tells us one very important thing. In the DNA testing that we have done up to this point, we've had 2 DNA tests run. In both cases, the mitochondrial DNA of the Starchild pulls up. The nuclear does not. The nuclear, which is what you need to find out what dad and mom were like. Mitochondrial DNA tells you about mom. Nuclear DNA, the DNA from the nucleus of the cell, tells you about mom and dad. The mitochondrial DNA floats outside the nucleus. All right? So, if indeed this is organic material, even at 900 years, we should have gotten a read on the nuclear DNA if it's normal human DNA. Because what they do is they send something called primers. They put primers in the mix. And the primers are like a lock and key situation where they're set to pull out certain strings of base pairs. And they match perfectly, they pull out, they compare, and they see how one compares to another. But they've been unable, even though they very easily recovered the mitochondrial DNA, to recover the nuclear DNA. At the time, we figured, oops, it's too degraded. The nuclear DNA is too degraded. That's very typical of ancient bone. That's why recovery of ancient nuclear DNA is so difficult. So we just went with the idea that, well, it's degraded. It was buried maybe in acidic soil, and it's degraded. But the human pulled right up, both mitochondrial and nuclear, very easily, even after 900 years. Why? Because no degradation. It's in a mine tunnel. It's not rained on. It's not baked by the sun. There's very little degradation in the human bone. So its mitochondrial DNA and its nuclear DNA pulled up very easily both times. The Starchild's mitochondrial DNA pulls up, but its nuclear DNA doesn't. If this is organic material, there's no reason for that to have happened, except that when the primers go in, they can't find what they're looking for. They can't find human DNA. That's the answer that we have on our plate right now. So we're going to do a third DNA test starting in early September, and we're going to try with the knowledge that this stuff is here, and we're going to do it some different ways to see if we can pull out that nuclear DNA, because we have to find out what the DNA of this thing is all about. Okay, next slide. These are some of the tests that we still have to do, things we still need to do. That third DNA analysis that will be underway at 1st of September. Detailed dental analysis to find out the enamel surface and chemistry. Maldi-Toff test to find out whether it's bacteria or fungi in the fibers. Detailed analysis of the fibers and the residue, whatever it is, the chemistry, microtomography, get 3D data on the internal structure of the bones and see if in fact there is a layering.